Thank you. This means I don't have to talk about myself. I can talk about the planet. So I wanted to start with this image because I wanted us to start with a really expanded perspective, to actually start from outside our Earth, outside ourselves, and to think cosmically. Yesterday, Pasi showed us some charts that showed the parts per million of carbon dioxide increasing in the atmosphere, and he showed us the time frame, the millennia of history going back in time. So if we just take that expanded perspective of place and time, you know, here we are. So we'll just begin from this point. So I'm going to talk about what kind of museum is possible in a planetary emergency. And in the program, I said, this is an emergency. So we are declaring, I am declaring, this is an emergency. So what I'm going to be talking about is how I'm trying to change in my practice and to give you some inspiration for how you might be able to change in your work because this planet is in crisis. Just working out where I'm probably holding it upside down. Yes. So I'm going to talk through some frames for thinking and then some movements in the cultural sector that are inspiring. Then I'm going to focus in a bit more and talk about some inspiring museums, and then a little bit about my own Climate Museum UK as an experiment, and then concluding with some ways to be a first responder museum. So when I say first responder, this is a term for an emergency service like fire or flood or police. That's the idea that they're the first people to respond in an emergency. So you might think, well, museums would be maybe the last to respond, or very slow to respond. But maybe if we just change our thinking, maybe we are the first place that people might come, because this is a different kind of emergency. This is a big, complex kind of situation. So we started with a big expanded perspective of our place, and now if we think about in time, this is the global temperatures over the past 170 years. Have you seen this colour, this colourway before? Is this familiar to you? You've seen it. So this is a new standard for representing the global temperature change, going from blue to red, and it's been developed by somebody called Ed Hawkins. You can find it on showyourstripes.info. He found that blue and red is a universal colour scheme. People everywhere understand that blue is cool, red is hot. So this is a much better way of representing colour change, temperature change. It's also very good for people who are colourblind. It's better than the rainbow that has been used too much. So we use this colourway in our museum communications, but I'm showing it to you now because what's really interesting is how the temperature started to change. When you see it like this, it's like seeing it as a big pattern. It's almost like a museum of temperatures. But you can see halfway through, maybe about 80 years ago, the temperature started to change. So really, that's when there was a climate crisis. In 1907, the first impacts of climate change, of industrial burning of fossil fuels, started to affect the way people lived. And then in the 1970s, the droughts that we have heard so much about in the Sahel region of Africa, they were caused by human anthropogenic global warming. We don't often think about that, but it is, it's a historic problem. But in the past year, Greta has been raising our awareness, and there have been, there's a rise in global activism. So now everybody thinks, this is the year, this is the year of that it matters to people. But actually, it's been mattering to people and affecting people's lives for, ever since the colours started becoming pale blue. So, that's another way of thinking, an expanded perspective. So let's see the world again, another way. This is a moment in time, 2014 to 2018, showing the sort of the pattern, the tendency of temperature, of warming. And you can see that the warming is hugely concentrated in the northern hemisphere across the Arctic. So, and also somewhat in the south. So climate change is not evenly distributed. It is, the temperature change is, we talk about limiting global temperature rise to 2 degrees centigrade, but the temperature change is hugely different across the globe. So that means that it's causing rapid melting of the Arctic ice, and also the effects are unevenly distributed on people. So, our house is on fire. So, and included in our house are all the art and the museums, all of the heritage that we care for. We only have one house. So what can we do? What can culture do when our world is on fire, our house is on fire? So if we are going to be the first responders to this emergency, while also being, the victims, because we are within this house that's burning, what do we do? Can we help to alert the world to danger? Can we help create a safer world? And can we actually care for those affected? So that educational role and also the caring role is really what I want to emphasize. So I'm going to start with this frame, thinking about time and urgency. So we have a big kind of problem to deal with when we think about our response. And it causes arguments. Should we act fast or should we act slow? Do we just address action within our own realm, or do we care about the wider world, the bigger system? Basically, we have to act fast and accept that change is already happening. And so there are 3 dimensions of action. We often hear about mitigation and adaptation, reducing emissions and adapting to change. But there is a 3rd dimension that we rarely hear about, and it's reducing suffering. Because we saw from the global temperature chart that for too long, 70, 80 years, well, actually, we've known that burning fossil fuels causes climate change since 1856. But the time that we've delayed, the what you might even call predatory delay, the delay has been artificially created by those who want to profit from the continued extraction of fossil fuels. That delay has meant that we now need to start thinking not only about adaptation, but reducing suffering. The suffering that is caused by the delay. So the need to mitigate is going up all the time. The need to adapt is even more, and then the need to reduce suffering is like the upward chart that Pasi showed us yesterday. It's huge. But the chances to tackle the causes that are reducing all the time, the chances to adapt to impacts are reducing even more, and the chances to reduce suffering are reducing greatly. Does that make sense? And the time that we have is less than you think. So if we take that perspective of mitigation, adaptation, and reducing suffering, this can be used maybe to frame how you might plan to take action in your organizations. So aim 1 would be to help mitigate the emissions. So the very first and easiest thing you can do is to reduce your footprint to real zero or net zero. I know that's not easy, but it's the easiest thing in the big picture. So that might mean having biodiversity in your sites, more ecological enterprise, better waste and recycling. So you might have targets as well that are about getting buy-in from your board, educating staff. And a good framework that I propose is called the Museum's Educational Framework that was created by Julie's Bicycle in the UK. If you don't have frameworks like this in Finland, I don't know, perhaps you do, but it's a pretty good one that has been created in the UK. Then aim 2 might be working with people in your places to transition to a lower footprint. So this is still a mitigation aim, but it's much more about working with your communities, and it's more important than reducing your own operations to net zero. So that's about telling the truth, improving your collaborating with people to improve biodiversity in the local area, reducing the visitor footprint, so working with local governments to improve transport, supporting climate activism, supporting local green enterprise. So these are really important things to be doing. Aim 3 is about adaptation. So this is about ensuring that people and places are safe and well as the impacts hit. And the impacts are not just about local impacts, for example, rising sea levels and how they might affect coastal heritage, for example. It's about things like how the rising temperatures are affecting global crop supplies. And I'm sure in Finland you don't sustain your own food. Do you see what I mean? You must rely on imports of food. So the impacts are not just direct, observable local impacts. They're more complicated than that. So the kind of adaptation plans you might have might even be preparing to move your organization. I know it sounds drastic, but as Elizabeth showed us yesterday, a third of museums are built in low-lying or coastal areas or areas that are at threat of severe storms. So, it really has to be a consideration. If you are caring for heritage, then you have to think about how can this be protected or perhaps have to move. But also maybe more positively, collecting threatened heritage, opening up your decision-making to the public to talk about how you might adapt to these impacts. Aim 4 is about reducing suffering. So doing all that's possible to reduce suffering and injustice. And that might mean in your work prioritizing young people or working with, collaborating internationally to support frontline land defenders and promoting, well, in Finland, maybe you don't need to promote a democratic approach to politics because you have one of the most democratic societies in the world, but maybe you can lead, you can help internationally. You know, come to the UK, tell our politicians why democracy is important. I won't talk about UK politics anymore, I promise. So each aim massively increases in the effort and the imagination it requires. But there is a conundrum here. Mitigation is the best form of adaptation. We have to reduce our emissions rapidly. We have to do everything that we can. So when I argue for adaptation and reducing suffering, I'm not arguing that we forget about mitigation. What I'm saying is that if you have an expanded perspective and you think about justice as your end goal, then justice runs through your concerns when you are planning your mitigation. So it's really about caring for people and other species as your driver for change. So I'm going to give a quick example of an organisation that has recently made a plan for environmental action which doesn't just focus on mitigation within its operations. So The Guardian, which is a promoter of democracy and justice in the UK, now in the world really, so this is really blatant on its website and on every article you read. Its environmental pledge, it's highly visible, and their pledge begins with their mission. They are, in some ways, museums are also kind of media or educational organisations like The Guardian, so I think it's relevant. So we will continue our long-standing record of powerful environmental reporting. We will report on how environmental collapse is already affecting people. So they are talking about, a global justice perspective. We will use language that recognises the severity of the crisis we're in. This has been influenced by one of their leading journalists, George Monbiot, who has been exploring how we need to change our language. So they've got a new editorial code that they will talk about climate breakdown rather than just climate change, for example. And then, at the bottom, we will achieve net zero emissions by 2030. So that's an example. Moving on, this is another way of thinking, another, I hope, helpful frame for thinking. It's a word I've invented called being positopian. So this is the cone of futures, the cone of possible, plausible and probable futures that Elizabeth showed us yesterday. And I really want to shift. It's a little bit like with thinking about the long end goal of justice. Think about the full range of possibilities when you are thinking or discussing what to do. And so this means having to entertain more frightening and dark scenarios, but it also means having to entertain more wildly positive and imaginative futures, more radical and regenerative ways of living. So we need to spend much more time in that wide cone of possibility, using our imagination. And I really think that museums are one of the best type of organisation to help people, to help the public be more positopian. Another frame is about how we perceive the goal of education, or the kind of people we want young people to become. And we have, in the UK particularly, which has been very influenced by America, we are overwhelmingly consumerist in our frame. So when we think about environmental change, the emphasis is on people as consumers. So the advice to us is consume less, don't be defined by what you consume. We don't hear this enough, but I would advise don't feel guilty or don't accuse others about what they consume. Don't stop at single actions. This is really important. There's a single action bias that people think, I don't buy bottled water, so I'm doing my bit. But we mustn't stop at that single action. So then there's another frame, which is being a citizen. And in the UK, we're starting to see more museums promote and explore active citizenship. But and this is really important, but it needs to be, I think, much more ecologically framed. So we need to start thinking about what is an ecological citizen, and I would say it's a person that cares for all beings, all living beings. But I really want to push museums to start thinking about being system changers and working with people to help them be system changers. So again, it's pushing beyond the norm to a more expanded frame of what people can be. So system changers can be people that restore or rewild nature, that think bigger than just about their consumption, to be activists, to encourage divestment from oil industries, for example. System changers might think that if I set up an ecological business, I can change the system. System changers collaborate across disciplines and they change other people's mindsets. So my challenge to museums is, when you think about the capacities you want to create in people through your education programs or through your exhibitions, try to create system changes. So I'm going to run through some inspiring movements. I just put that up there because he is, as an individual, he represents, a clear and present danger to the stability of our planet. He's just confirmed that the US will pull out of the Paris Accord. And, right next to him is someone who is an icon of the opposition, of the opposite, the resistance to that threat. So in a way, two massive influential movements that are affecting our planet are represented in that one image. So one movement is the Art Not Oil Coalition. This is, it originated in the UK, but it's now growing internationally. It's a movement of several different groups who campaign to end the sponsorship of culture by fossil fuels, mostly oil, of course. So this image is a typical protest by BP or not BP, who are campaigning against, in this case, the sponsorship of the British Museum. So the reason it's a really important movement is that, the fossil fuel industries are why we are here. We have this long history of extractivism. And now our democracies are corrupted by what I call pollutocrats. Actually, that's a word invented by George Monbiot. Not just plutocrats, but pollutocrats. So they have enabled predatory delay, parasitic globalism, what Elizabeth yesterday was talking about, stealing from future generations. And also they promote this idea of impossible futurism, techno-utopia. It's this idea of we can take action in the future, we just need to get rich enough first before we can invest in future change. And it's this cultural sponsorship that gives them the social license to operate. So our movement, Art Not Oil, we've created the oil sponsorship free pledge. So you can go to that website and pledge not to receive sponsorship by fossil fuels and put the badge on on your publicity. Can I just ask, is any organisation here sponsored by a fossil fuel company? Are you prepared to admit? No, there's none. Wow. So again, you are international leaders. You know, why not tell other countries how brilliant your sector is, that you are not, and I assume never will be, sponsored by fossil fuels. So this is the next movement. This is Culture Declares Emergency, and this is the launch of it in April this year in the Tate Turbine Hall. And that's quite significant because the Tate, or Tate Modern, was built in a power station. It's it was a coal-powered power station, and the new extension is the Blavatnik building. It cost £270 million. It's just an extension of a museum, but most of it was funded by a plutocrat, a man who got rich from oil. So the whole place, is just reeking with the history of coal and oil. But here we are, saying culture declares emergency. These protesters are wearing coats made from grass by the artists Ackroyd and Harvey. The coat actually has the words truth on the back, so we are telling the truth. So the idea of Culture Declares Emergency is that people, individuals and organisations, sign up to declare emergency, but it doesn't end there. Too often, just declaring emergency is seen as it's a performance. Too many local governments have declared emergency but then done nothing. So this is a community where we keep helping each other and reminding each other that we are pledging to take action. We are taking action. So we have meetings and events. So we have a toolkit that helps people plan in their organizations what to do. We have resources that help you make an announcement. You can sign up from anywhere. It's a global movement. And we also encourage self-organizing groups to set up. So we've got Culture Declares Australia launching very soon, Culture Declares France, Culture Declares Berlin. So please create Culture Declares Finland, or Culture Declares, I don't know, museums in Finland. So we not only are a community of support, we also join protests. So we supported the Global Strike Day with a rally for the imagination, and we joined up with other sectors. For example, architects declare emergency, and we gathered at Nelson's Column, and we read and sang and used culture. We've also been commissioned by the Museums Association to run the Festival of Change. So we ran this at the Museums Association conference last month. And, hang on, I want to tell you about this book. We've also created this project called Letters to the Earth, where thousands of people submitted creative writing that are letters to the earth, and we've just published this book, or it's just about to be published. So it's a movement with many tentacles and really trying to make change very fast. It's been exhausting as well. So just here's another movement. I wanted to include this to squeeze it in. I was at the launch of the Climate Heritage Network a couple of weeks ago in Edinburgh, and the reason I think this is really important, it's a global network. Heritage includes museums and the arts. It's really important because it focuses a little bit more on adaptation than other networks that you'll see around the world. It really comes from very pragmatic types of work, led by people in the, working in archaeology, the built environment, but it also includes intangible heritage as well. And it really recognizes that heritage is threatened by climate change, is a cause, culture is a cause of climate change, but also that it offers us solutions. So do find that Climate Heritage Network and sign up to it. They're keen to expand. I'm just going to run through some inspiring museums that are tackling the emergency. All of these examples come from the UK, so I hope it's refreshing and new to you. So the University of Cambridge, their museums work very strongly with scientists and researchers in the university. So it's a great example, really, of interdisciplinary collaboration. But they're really doing interesting experimental things. So, for example, 2 years ago, they held a climate hack, and they invited, it's a little bit like your Lion's Den approach. They invited teams of people to come and develop ideas for how museums might work with the public. I was in one of the teams, and we created a boat out of ghost fishing nets to raise awareness of the threats to islands in the Pacific, like Kiribati. So we created a whole range of kind of storytelling resources around this boat. We only had about 3 hours to make it, that's why it looks a bit rough. And now they're commissioning all kinds of games, hybrid games that take place around the museums in Cambridge. So museums are starting to support activism, and this example again is the other Oxford, which is full of universities, and they are starting to do more work around climate and environment. The Museum of Natural History has been running a course for young people, Saturday workshops on how to speak truth to power. So they're really understanding the history of the environmental crisis, and they're working through to the final step, which is how to present your climate message. So they're not just listening to young people, they are giving young people the tools to be heard, to be more effective at communicating. So another example is Norwich Castle Museum, which is putting the environment at the heart of all of their policies. They told me about their approach because I put this tweet out which said, what if your sustainability committee or environmental policy group was renamed an emergency response group? Because, I do think that language matters. If we call things what they are, this is an emergency, not just a situation that we need to sustain, I really think that changes things. So Norwich Castle Museum is taking that idea on board. That was my first job. I worked there when I was 18. So, yeah. An example, yes, I said these were all from the UK, but I thought I'd just include this example from Sweden, the World Culture Museum, who, if you haven't travelled there, has anyone travelled to, I can't say it in the Swedish way, Gothenburg? Has anyone travelled? You've seen this exhibition? Okay, but not the human nature exhibition. It's really wonderful. It's very honest, and it really covers huge themes, and it really does get to the root of the issue that it is about emotion. We have so many. It's not just a technical issue, it's a really human and emotional issue, and the exhibition really tries to address that. It also is big, it's expanded in its perspective. It helps people think about the planetary boundaries and how they all intersect, Of course, the planetary boundaries idea comes from the Stockholm Resilience Institute, so it makes sense a Swedish museum would represent that well. You can refuse fossil fuel sponsorship. I've mentioned this before, but here's an example of a gallery that is doing so. This is a museum that is being ecocentric. They are promoting care for all beings. This is Bristol Museum, and they've covered up some of their extinct species with funeral shrouds, with black shrouds. And this came about because children wrote to them and said, wanted to know more about the history of these extinct species. And so the museum had a dialogue with the children at this school, and the children suggested shrouding the animals. Have you seen this donut image before, the donut model? Okay, so this is the donut framework by Kate Raworth. The idea is that that we need to produce the conditions for people to live well, but within the limits to growth, within the planetary boundaries. And so this donut model has been really inspiring for a project called the Happy Museum. So this is a project that's been running in the UK for 10 years and has involved around 60 museums in exploring well-being for people, place and planet. So actually this is I should have really put this in the movement section, but in a way it's individual museums are doing really interesting things, exploring well-being. So, for example, Derby Museums Trust is a really good example. I haven't got time to go into the detail, but please go to the website, and there's lots of resources there. So, moving on, can a museum be a first responder to the emergency? So, my project, Climate Museum UK, is a real experiment. A very small scale experiment, really. We don't really have budget. I had the idea a year ago, so we're very, very new. And it's really about testing the idea that that a museum can respond rapidly and really try to make system change. So it is an activist museum. As Minerva explained, it's a mobile and digital museum that stirs and collects responses to the climate and ecological emergency. And we are very led by principles, including being positopian, but also being compassionate, holistic, consultative, intersectional. But really the first rule is talking about climate change. So we're not about converting people to a particular way of understanding. It's really about using museum approaches and using collections and objects to encourage people to talk. So we pop up. We've been popping up since January, so not yet a year. We've popped up about 10 times with some of the objects. There's a team of about 9 of us. We're all volunteers, and we pop up and just run workshops, really, and test out how our approaches work. And the last pop-up was a proper exhibition. It ran for 5 days. And it was called Climate Talks. The poster design has gone funny. It doesn't look like that. So, yeah, it was a real challenge, actually. You know, doing exhibitions and public programs about climate is not easy. It says there it was art and playful ways to talk about the emergency, but it's exhausting. You know, you come away feeling drained. You know, you have some really deep and challenging conversations with people. quite often people don't want to come in. They see the word climate and they just want to walk on to the shops. So we have to find ways around this. Sometimes we won't use the word climate when we pop up, I think, because it's too difficult. But we did have an amazing response. People were writing letters about the climate. They were using Lego to construct regenerative ways to be. They were trying out some of our games. It was a really valuable experiment. So I'm just going to move on to my conclusion now. I don't know the time, so I hope I'm not running over. But here are just some a summary of principles for being a first responder museum. So the first important principle is to recognize the truth of the emergency. The second point is to do more anticipatory work. So I talked about being positopian and to spend more time playing around with scenarios and ideas about what is possible in the future, whether good or bad. So that means making more time to look ahead to the future. That doesn't just mean, more time spent planning, but more time actually expanding your perspective and thinking about what could happen and working with representatives of your audience to do that. I've mentioned the expanded perspective before. So that means that environmental work is all-encompassing. It covers every aspect of your museum's work. So it isn't just for, the people that deal with the building. It's for everybody. Use your assets. How can you use your collections and your histories to show beneficial connections between humans and ecosystems, but also where this has gone wrong? So how Elizabeth yesterday showed us the cone of possibility going backwards as well. Look at using your assets to show what are the hidden histories, what are we forgetting, what are we not talking about. Apply the precautionary principle. Is this a familiar concept in Finland? So the precautionary principle is about being anticipatory, looking ahead and thinking about the impact of your actions. So if you think that there is a possibility that, for example, building a new museum or expanding a museum might have negative impacts on the environment, then don't do it. Do something else instead. Put your energy somewhere else. Transform your learning programs so that people can be helped to become system changers, so that you can give skills to enable people to continue the thrivability of the living planet. Maybe you can promote ecological enterprise as a way for the museum to thrive. You can learn from the eco-museums movement, perhaps. And then finally, aim to act across that full spectrum of mitigation, adaptation, and reducing suffering. And finally, don't go it alone. You can't tackle this emergency on your own. You have to form movements or join movements, but also inspire others. As I've said, you're leading in so many ways. None of you are sponsored by fossil fuels. Your country is exemplary in the way it's fair and democratic, and you have so much to share. So, join with these international movements and connect across disciplines and divides. So that's me. This is how you can contact me. My 3 hats: the Climate Museum, Culture Declares Emergency, and Flow Associates. And please ask me any questions.
Thank you, Bridget, for this most inspiring lecture. I think we really need advocates like you to encourage people in museums and other cultural fields to encounter this planetary emergency and start to take some action. Actually, what I was thinking that in the museums we are consuming more and more natural resources, and our carbon footprint is growing because we are making exhibitions, we are making new site buildings and so on. And also a lot of traveling exhibitions come to Finland from abroad. So what are your thoughts? Should we somehow try to limit ourselves, and maybe is the future for the from the exhibition part more that we should do like virtual reality exhibitions, digital exhibitions, things that there are not so much moving from one place to another?
Yeah, I think that's right. The Tate recently put on an exhibition of Olafur Eliasson's work, and it was the biggest footprint of any exhibition they've ever put on. But it was about his work is about the environment. So they had a theory of change that if we allow the emissions, maybe people will be educated and inspired to change. So you have to have, a theory of change in your planning to decide, is it worth the emissions because we might have this impact. But I don't know if they planned to emphasize the impact enough, if you see what I mean.
Yes,
they hoped that the exhibition would have this impact. They had faith in the power of art. But I wonder if what we need to do now is to be a lot more deliberate. If we want to have the impact, then we have to really experiment, to actually do studies, to treat our cultural programs as, as change-making, rather than just carrying on, putting on shows and hoping they will make change.
Yes, that's right. Let me make some advertisement here. Eli huomenna aamulla toivottavasti mahdollisimman moni teistä on jo ilmoittautunut tai vielä ilmoittautuu. Kansallismuseossa on kello 9 tuolla auditoriossa. Puhutaan kokoelmatyön ja näyttelytyön, miten voidaan tehdä tämmöisiä konkreettisia ratkaisuja, jotta tämä hiilijalanjälki pienenee. Eli huomenna 9 Kansallismuseoon. Toivottavasti olette tulossa. Okay, because we are continuing the discussion tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock about these issues. Okay. But now, if you have some comments or questions, please. Okay, yeah.
Hello, I'm from the Sweden's National Heritage Board, and I was wondering about this, that you mentioned that when you did this pop-up exhibition and some people saw the word climate and I thought, oh, I don't want to go there. I sometimes feel that there is a gap between that the museums want to be very relevant in the debate and that people want to go to museums for entertainment. And I don't think that museums should be all about being entertained. I do think people also want to go to museums for to learn something, but how do we find a good balance here, a good mix between how do we make people want to come to the exhibitions? And you get my question?
Yeah, well, I think it comes back to what I was just saying, that we need to program according to the change that we want to make, not to the assumption that everything has to be about attracting people to come. So if the change we want to make is to change the way people work or think or talk, then we have to plan activities with people that will be effective. And it might be that means that we stop doing exhibitions, for example. So, everything has to change. I'm not saying that we should stop doing exhibitions, but we have to stop thinking about the model of attracting people and counting the numbers of people and counting the numbers of people in different demographic groups, because that model is not helping us make change. So, yeah, I hope that helps.
Yes, that's very good. Anyone else out there? There are several hands up, so.
Hello, my name is Maija, and I'm from Taike. And this is very connected to what you're talking about, because there's barely a single person in the whole world who doesn't know about these issues about climate change. And we are often encouraged to take action and do something about this. But is this not at the core of the problem, that we sort of always try to think that now we have to do more? What if we change the approach into doing less things? But of course, this is quite complicated, because our human value in the society is so often connected with productivity. But how can we exchange that with something else? What if we could do less? What if we could instead hang out? We would have more time to be with our beloved people. We would have less money, and we would have less consumption. We have all the material we need in the world already. Now it's just about how we wish to share that.
I agree with you. I don't know if I have anything to add, because I agree. But I also think that we do have to put lots and lots of energy and imagination into the situation, into the problem. And so that means I think we have to get much more active, much more focused on, understanding the problems, bringing people together to talk about them, doing things differently. I don't want us to stop doing. So I kind of agree, but I think I want to argue for a different way of doing. Yeah.
Okay, let's take one more question and then we move on. Okay.
Hi, thank you. My name is Carita Elko. I'm working in the Helsinki National Science Center. Just having read Kate Raworth's books about donut economy and reading now the probably for you familiar book about econocracy, the three young economist scientists rethinking how our economic models in the world should be rethought. And I think that is a topic that we should discuss, because it's a paradigm question, and as far as we are not recognizing the paradigm, we are talking about the details within the paradigm, and we are probably not seeing the problem as a whole. Thanks.
Yeah, I agree. So I didn't really go into the whole idea of paradigm change when I talked about system changes, but yes, I think that museums have a really important role to help the meta imagination, the meta understanding of the system. So, understanding it historically, understanding from the perspective of indigenous people, and understanding, all of those systems of exchange, and completely rethinking the idea of how we accumulate and, accumulate stocks, and then we really need to start thinking about flow, increasing flow. So, maybe there's a challenge. How can museums help us think about what you might... Well, I like this idea of fluminism, which is a new way of thinking, which encourages flow, to stop accumulating and to stop promoting the accumulation of goods as a valid way to develop people. So, yeah, that sounds, yeah.
Okay, thank you once more and applause.
Okay, thank you.